It probably seems to be so obvious to talk about Adam Steffen, as famous as he is, and everyone is well aware of his exploits and his contributions to history. It hardly seems even worth bothering going over what actually happened. Oh, you don't know who Adam Steffen is? Well, um, I'm kind of being facetious, obviously. If you knew who he was, I'd be shocked. And in fact, his contribution is one of those really strange contributions where he performs a pivotal action that probably changed the entire course of history. Uh, and this is a kind of thing that, if you like read Caesar's notes, he'll talk about how major historical events often turn on very trivial events where something tiny just basically turns the entire outcome of things. And his particular contribution to this is absolutely no different. Adam Steffen, uh, barely a paragraph worth of history behind him, with a couple of notable events, and but the one he probably had the biggest impact on, he doesn't get a whole lot of mention of. In his little bio on Wikipedia, they don't even mention this encounter, yet it's important. And I'm always leery of these kinds of history items because, you kind of look at the grand flow of things and things are heading in certain directions, things are happening. And then one person steps in, does something very unintentional, and then all of a sudden, all of history revolves on that little pivot. Uh, and you always wonder how much of history actually works that way. I mean, we know of certain instances, but is this is this very common and a lot of it's not reported because either people missed it or it just didn't get recorded later on. And this particular incident initially was attributed to an anonymous group, and later people put enough paper of the primary source material to figure out who this anonymous group was. So I guess time to tell the story. So if I just told his story, it lasts about 45 seconds. So let's tell the whole story. So uh, we're dealing with the opening of the Revolutionary War. The British have been forced to leave Boston because they consider the location untenable. This is following the Battle of Bunker Hill, which was kind of an indecisive battle, but it bolstered the morale of the colonialists because uh, the British were so adamant of that they were going to take this hill that they just basically marched up and just took brutal losses rolling up this hill that actually had no major value once they actually took it. So, I mean, it was very Vietnam esque in a way where, uh, they took the ground and the ground was not particularly valuable and it just cost them lots of lives to do it. The reason this is important is because this sets the mindset of the American generals at this point. Washington wasn't at Bunker Hill, but he did show up later to help uh, with troops he brought along with him from Virginia, as well as to help them do the siege because obviously a lot of the guys there at the siege had to kind of cycle out and go back home and take care of business since they were close to home. They're farmers for the most part, that kind of thing. So when it became apparent that the British were going to attempt to seize New York. Washington moved up rapidly up to New York in order to set up to prevent the British from being able to come in there and take it over. New York being the largest city in the colonies, it was considered a huge prize. Now, one of the things we don't understand about Washington as well as we should is although he has a fair amount of battle experience under his belt at this point, not all of it is particularly useful for the type of combat he's going to be facing. Um, he was involved in the French and Indian War and involved in wilderness fighting. Now, a lot of people take wilderness fighting to go, snipers! You got people scattered all over the place, just taking pot shots at the other army, and that's wilderness fighting. No, wilderness fighting is knowing the back ways in order to basically maneuver uh, to choke points where your enemy army is going to be passing through and setting up ambushes, and they're mass fire ambushes because that's the only way a smoothbore musket inflicts uh, a lot of deaths and injuries is masked because they're hideously inaccurate. So Washington's experience is primarily with wilderness fighting, and here we are essentially doing something akin to almost open. Well, I mean, it was a bit wooded at the time. The hills were wooded, etc., but it wasn't the deep, dense woods that the wilderness fighting was occurring in during the French and Indian War. So uh, his experience here is not particularly valuable. And his generals there were taking the lessons from Bunker Hill. They're saying, yeah, the British are a bunch of arrogant bastards, and they're going to try to sweep us off the hill. So if we set up on all the strong points, they're just going to march straight up the hill. We'll inflict massive casualties on them. Either they'll take so many casualties they'll give up, or once if they can force us off, we'll be able to pull off at our leisure, taking minimal casualties while inflicting massive casualties on them. A lot of these generals believed that's how the entirety of this war was going to play out. Well, unfortunately for Washington, the British weren't going to play by that book again. The British looked at the battlefield, they figured out the terrain, and they essentially rolled their flank and pushed them off the hill at huge losses to the American army, minimal to the British and Hessian army. And then essentially for the rest of the year, chased Washington's army out of New York and chased it south. By the time the American army reaches the Delaware River, it's pretty much shattered and useless. They've lost a lot of their guys have deserted by this point, and it's all they can do to keep the army together. When they cross the Delaware, what they do is they basically gather up all the boats up and down the river in a fairly large range, and they use it to ferry their men across. And then they keep these boats on the other side, and whatever boats they don't end up using, they send patrols up and down the river, destroying any boat they're actually not using. So what they did was they put a temporary barrier between them, the British Army. The British end up deciding to garrison Trenton with Hessian troops. And at this point, the Americans, and there's actually a lot of Dutch, Pennsylvania Dutch in their corps at this point, who are actually, and that's you probably some of you are aware of the Pennsylvania Dutch were actually Deutsch, which they were actually Germans, and so they had a fair amount of German American soldiers fighting on their side as well. But these all the American troops were terrified of the Hessians. The Hessians had been very brutal in the New York battle. They had bayoneted the wounded and surrendering guys on the ground because they were kind of ordered to essentially be butchers, saying, "Hey, we want to terrorize these guys, break them completely, and sap the will out of them, so that this fight, this rebellion, comes to a very rapid close." By the time we get to where Washington is considering the raid on Trenton, uh, his army's in pretty bad shape. It's a shadow of its former self. Uh, their rations are low. Their equipment is low. They're ill clothed. Luckily, the winter was somewhat mild, but they were not in the best place. Their enlistment papers were going to be up on January 1st, and it was expected that the what who remained would probably get up and leave. Uh, People were already talking about, what do we do now that we've lost? How do we reapproach the British? How do we get terms that are uh, acceptable? What can we do? So we're at the point where the revolution's about to end, and it's about to go out in a poof, a little smoke. Now, one of the things that both sides had to contend with was, you're dealing with a situation where pretty much everybody kind of looks like it's not like you have people you can look at. Oh, there's the enemy. No, we everybody pretty much looks alike. Pretty much everybody talks alike, and even if people have off accents, it's not unusual for a colonial American to be attached to the British Army as a Tory. So there is nothing distinguishable about who the enemy is. So this is both boon and bane for both sides, because both sides are heavily infiltrated with spies constantly. Some of them are embedded in critical positions, learning everything that's going on, while there's other roving bands of spies who literally go into one camp, learn everything they can about what's going on, go over to the other camp, sell the information about what they just found out, while at the same time sizing up the Americans, then go back to the British and sell the information. So both sides had really good intelligence on each other, on at least their dispositions. Uh, Now, there are some uh, controversy about how bad the morale was in the American army, because, on one hand, Washington did use a lot of disinformation, but at the same time, there was every reason to be horribly depressed based on what they had gone on. Um, so when Washington decides to do his raid on Trenton, uh, it is desperate enough that allegedly he told his generals that either he and the army will march into Trenton, or he will march into Trenton alone. Essentially, at the point where it's like, we don't have a choice, and if I get mowed down in a hail of gunfire at this point, you know that's how close to the edge we are. So Washington comes up with a very good plan. It's very detailed. There's a main body going to cross the river. Their goal is to have a pre-dawn raid on Trenton, catch them off guard. Meanwhile, they would have uh, armies to the south and north that would cut both the reinforcement routes and the escape routes of the Hessian soldiers in Trenton. Uh, so it takes several days of preparation, because obviously he has to have his war council. He has to sit down, decide what they're going to do, make sure, and then start doing the preparations, and then start giving out increased rations for the march. getting the ammunition together, gathering the boats, and all the planning that goes in. So it's not something they do on spur of the moment. It takes days to put this all together. Well, while this is happening, the spies who are moving back and forth between the Hessian camps and the American camps have pretty much gone over and reported to Colonel Rahl, head of the Hessians in Trenton, everything that's going on. Uh, and Rahl is kind of, uh, he has a public persona and a private persona in this. His public persona is telling everyone, don't worry about them. The American army is nothing. We have nothing to fear. It's no big deal. They're a bunch of farmers. In private, he was sending messages to the British saying, you need to start considering staging reinforcements in the nearby towns to both protect the roads and to protect our lines of communication. So Rahl was not absolutely arrogant, nor was he completely unaware of the potential danger. He believed Trenton was kind of a death trap, that it was not defensible, and he was not happy about the situation. But the British were pretty much convinced that, no, the American army's done. We don't really have to worry about this. So, from the British standpoint, all they were doing was waiting for the river to freeze. And once the river froze, they were going to cross the river and continue their pursuit of Washington, preferably, either killing or capturing them and ending this entire revolution once and for all. So, Colonel Rahl was completely aware of the American plans. He knew their rough strength. He knew when they were crossing. He knew when the intended time of attack was. So he actually had his troops on some level of alert. He was not just blowing this off as something to be ignored. So he took it serious. And if things had continued along those lines, it's very likely the Hessians could have stopped the Americans in their tracks, and the raid on Trenton would have failed. So, how does this start to actually work? Well, Washington's moving his men along the road, and one of the things that happened was it took a lot longer to get across the river than they thought it was going to. So their pre-dawn raid was not going to happen. It was going to be an after-dawn raid. Well, something weird happened. And that weird, of course, would be Adam Stephan. Adam Stephan was an officer in the American military. He had served under Washington in the French and Indian War. Not sure about exactly how great a general he was, but he was loyal and did what he was supposed to do. And what had happened is the details are kind of sketchy, but he was not part of the invasion force. He had a detachment of 50 men, and he'd been operating on the British Hessian side of the river, essentially doing a harassment campaign. Just looking for targets of opportunity, hitting it and falling back just to be a nuisance. And he had no idea Washington was getting ready to cross the Delaware and do this attack on Trenton. And by happenstance, he decided, we're near Trenton. Let's do a quick raid on Trenton just to mess with them. So before Washington's troops made it to Trenton, Stephan showed up with his 50 guys pre-dawn, right when Rahl was expecting the great American attack, and Adam Stephan and his troops basically raided an outpost, one of the guard outposts. Don't even think they hurt anyone. It's open fired, did a bunch of harassment shooting, and then walked off. And they almost got killed by the American army because they came walking right into them as they were leaving. They were heading towards the river, and he reported to Washington what had happened, and Washington was like, "Oh crap, you just gave us away. You may have just basically got us all killed." But here's the funny part. So Rall, expecting a pre-dawn attack, got one. And when it turned out to be anemic, it's like, okay, somebody shot at one of our guard outposts and nothing, came of it. That must be the end of it. So that was what we heard about. So it was overblown. It wasn't as bad as we thought it was going to be. So he pretty much let his soldiers stand down. Most of his soldiers, if they were on any kind of alert, went back to bed, and essentially the guard posts were at their normal level of activity. So Adam Steffen inadvertently triggered Rall's expectations for the attack. Rall thought the attack was over. So the surprise was fully intact, even though Rall knew they were coming, but Washington was there several hours later than they were supposed to be, and Adam Steffen was there when they were expecting an attack. So, as the rest of the history goes, this victory and a couple of victories that come after it with Princeton and a battle of one of the creek crossings ends up reinvigorating the American army, reinvigorating the revolutionary spirit, cheering up Congress so they decide that, hey, maybe we don't need to start working on, how do we capitulate? We can continue this war. And so they get the financial backing, the more volunteers, and enough equipment to continue the war. And the war will continue from there on to victory. However, most likely, if Adam Steffen hadn't stepped in and did this little pre-dawn attack, Rall would have been fully on alert when the American troops arrived. So, weird thing how history ends up coming out. Now, Adam Steffen, what will end up happening to him is about a year from now, he ends up in a battle that isn't particular. The outcome wasn't critical to the war itself, but he was accused of being drunk during the war, and he was court-martialed and essentially relieved of his duty. And so that's kind of the end of his history. So, makes you wonder, how many more critical historical events that are kind of depicted as these grand sweeping movements of history actually hinged on these weird little pivot points? And this guy we know so little about very well changed the outcome of things in such a way where we probably wouldn't have a country, or at least it wouldn't have occurred the way we thought it would have. So there's a thought for you tonight, the oddities of history. If you like this, like it. If you have comments on it, please comment. If you know someone you think might like it, share it. And of course, I appreciate you spending time with me tonight. I hope to see you again in a future video.